Hi everyone. So this is our fourth and final lecture for chapter 4, and in module 4 we are going to focus on our sense of touch, or our senses of touch I should say, as well as our sense of taste and our sense of smell. So module 4.4 is called Touch and the Chemical Senses. And so our sense of taste and our sense of smell are both considered to be chemical senses, in that the stimulus that we actually kind of take into our system and is picked up by the sensory receptors in those two systems is actually kind of chemicals in the air. So whereas for vision, we're talking about light waves of the stimulus, for hearing, we're talking about sound waves as a stimulus. When we're talking about both our sense of taste and our sense of smell, the stimulus for each of those are different chemicals that enter through our nasal passages as well as through our mouths. So first we're going to talk briefly about your sense of touch. So there are several basic skin senses. So typically we talk about pressure, temperature, and pain, and each of these may include variations as well. So things like itch, tickle, painful burning, etc. There are a lot of kind of other skin senses that kind of fit into one or more of these categories. Then we have something called haptics, which is the active exploratory aspect of touch, sensation, and perception. And there's actually a disorder that you can have called tactile agnosia, where you are not able to identify things by haptics. So you're not able to use your hand, your sense of touch, to kind of identify what it is you're holding, which is very interesting because often, when you're a kid and stuff, you might play games where you have to kind of stick your hand into a box and try to figure out what it is you're touching. So someone with tactile agnosia would be completely unable to participate in that type of task. And so it is difficult for us to find distinct receptors for the various skin sensations, but there are certain nerve fibers that have been identified for some types of itching and possibly cold. So unlike in the other senses, when we talk about our sense of hearing, and we know that our receptors are those cilia cells, and then our sense of vision, and we know the receptors are the rods and cones and the retina, with touch, it's not quite apparent what the primary receptors are. But we have identified some. Receptors have also been identified as located in muscles, joints, and tendons. So we can have external receptors that are kind of within our skin, and we can also have internal receptors for touch sensations as well. And haptics, so that exploratory aspect of touch, works in conjunction with kinesthesis, which is our sense of bodily motion and position, in order to help us coordinate our movements. So if we did not have those two senses, we wouldn't really be able to walk, we wouldn't be able to get around very well. It would be very hard for us to navigate our environment. So now we're going to talk briefly about the mystery of pain, because I did mention pain is one of our touch senses, but it is something that for a long time has been quite misunderstood and something that we're still actively working on finding kind of a foolproof theory for. So pain is known as both a skin sense as well as an internal sense, and it differs from all the other senses in that the sensation may continue after the stimulus has long been removed. So if you walk into a room with bright lights, that bright light is going to affect your eye immediately. Those light waves are going to enter your eye, but as soon as you turn off the light or you leave the room, that sense goes away. So you're no longer perceiving that stimulus. With pain, on the other hand, if you are, you stub your toe, for example, on your bedpost, and that's going to affect you for a couple minutes afterwards in a really intense way, but you're probably going to feel an occasional twinge in your toe even for the next day or two. Right? So even after the actual stimulus is removed, the pain can kind of persist long after it's gone. We have something called nociception, which is the activity of the nerve pathways that respond to uncomfortable stimulation. So we actually have nociceptors, which would be the receptors for the sense, in our skin, our teeth, our corneas, as well, our corneas, as well as our internal organs. And one of the most popular theories of pain, and the one that probably has the most evidence behind it, is the gate control theory, which basically explains that we experience pain as an interaction between the nerves that transmit the pain messages, but also those that inhibit the messages. So basically, in the gate theory of pain, it would say that when your body tissue is injured, so say you cut your finger, the fibers open a gate and they allow the pain messages to kind of get up and reach the brain. So think of it, you cut your finger, and that sensation is rushing through your nerves and kind of through your peripheral nerves, up your central nervous system to your brain. And basically what gate control theory is saying is that there's then kind of at maybe the top of your spinal cord, there's like an imaginary gate that the pain signal has to make its way through in order for it to get up to the brain and be perceived as painful. And so basically this theory would say that if we don't have kind of the opening of that gate, then we're not actually going to feel that painful stimulus. So that our pain level, our experience of pain kind of relies on whether or not that gate is to open based on whatever stimulus that we're encountering. And so this theory does correctly predict that our thoughts and feelings can influence our reaction to pain. So for example, you've probably all noticed that say you did stub your toe or cut your finger, the more you pay attention to it, the more you think about it, the more likely you are going to feel it, right? Whereas if you get distracted, say you've got a really big test coming up and you got a paper cut on your finger, but a few minutes later you're back to studying and you don't notice it, you kind of stop feeling that sensation, so it doesn't really persist as long. But if you look down and maybe you notice, there's a drop of blood on it, or you kind of notice that the cut's still there, then you might kind of feel a twinge again. So depending on how much attention you're paying to the area that's damaged, that was causing you pain, that can influence your experience of the pain sensation as well. So while it's very useful to think of pain in terms of gate control theory, it does not explain severe chronic pain, which may occur without any sign of injury or disease. So the fact that people can have pain that's occurring pretty much near constantly, that wouldn't really make much sense with this gate control theory that says that you only allow those pain signals in, at certain times. And also something like a phantom limb sensation obviously cannot be explained by this type of theory. So basically a phantom limb sensation is something that's frequently experienced by amputees, somebody who has lost, just say, a leg or an arm or even a hand, a finger, and a lot of the time they will report pain as well as other sensations as coming from that absent limb. So they may have had their left arm amputated at the elbow, but they still feel pain in their left wrist. They can report feeling pain just like something was, hitting them in the wrist or kind of clenching the wrist. And so based on that, it became clear that obviously there are some kind of pain signals that can persist even in the absence of an actual physical stimulus, because at that point, you don't even have that limb anymore, but you still feel like you're feeling pain in it. And so researchers have then revised gate control theory to state that the brain does not only respond to incoming signals about pain, but it can also generate pain on its own. So there is still that kind of gate that allows pain messages to get through or not, but that even in the absence of a stimulus, the brain itself kind of has a matrix of neurons that gives us a sense of our bodies, and when this matrix produces abnormal patterns of activity, then we feel a sensation of pain, even in the absence of any external stimuli. So there's no theory that completely explains phantom pain, like phantom limb sensations. It possibly has to do with brain reorganization after an incident, maybe the same area that was originally used to tell you whether there was pain in your left wrist is now reorganized to talk about what's going on in your left foot, to kind of give you information about that. But because your brain still perceives it as the area related to your left wrist, you're still kind of perceiving the pain as coming from there. So even though we haven't really fully found out, a solid explanation behind phantom pain, we have figured out ways in which we can help alleviate it. And I just want to talk briefly about them because I think that is really interesting research. So this is what's known as a mirror box. So a mirror box is the most common type of therapy used to treat patients with limb amputation or phantom limb syndrome. And so basically what it does is by putting your other limb, the limb that you still have, say if you lost, again, your left arm, you put your right arm into this box. And what it does is it shows you a mirror image. So you'll have your right arm that's physically in the box, and the mirror will reflect your right arm in a way that makes it look like your left arm is also in the box as well. So basically you're tricking your brain into thinking that you actually have, both of your limbs still. So you can see in this box, even though she's only got one limb in it, you can see the reflection of it, which makes it look like her second limb. So it looks like she still has her left hand there. And so if she was feeling pain, say that felt like she was constantly clenching her left fist, then by kind of clenching and unclenching her right fist while it's in that mirror box, well, it looks like she's doing the same thing with her left fist. And oddly enough, by some mechanism, this actually does help decrease reported pain in individuals with phantom limb syndrome. So really interesting research. Still not 100% understood what's kind of going on here, but definitely something that's very interesting to keep in mind for sure. Now we're going to talk very briefly about our sense of taste. So taste is known as our gustatory system, and it functions in both the sensation and the perception of taste. So we have those tiny bumps on our tongue, which I'm sure you've all seen if you look at your tongue in the mirror, especially if you have kind of a little magnifying glass, you'll notice that it's covered in tiny bumps. They are called the papillae, and they house the taste buds. So they actually aren't the taste buds themselves, although a lot of people think the bumps are the taste buds. They're not. The taste buds are within the papillae, and within the taste buds is where the actual receptor cells for taste are. So there are actually a whole bunch of receptor cells within each taste bud as well. And so there are roughly about 9,000 on the tongue and 1,000 on the sides and the roof of the mouth. The taste receptor cells, like I mentioned, are inside of the taste buds, so there are actually 15 to 50 per bud, and they're replaced approximately every 10 days, but the total number does tend to decline after the age of 40, which might explain why as people age and become adults and get later in life, sometimes they develop taste for things that they originally really didn't like in their childhood, because perhaps their palate is kind of changing as their overall number of taste buds declines. So approximately 2,500 chemical compounds in the food we eat combine to give us diverse taste sensations. But we do have some that we consider kind of our classic basic tastes. So you've probably all heard of your sweet, salty, your bitter, and sour, which are four kind of classic basic tastes. But there is now a fifth that we've added, which is umami. And umami basically, it describes the taste of the compound MSG, which is something that's found in a lot of different types of food, and it is something that's actually kind of been linked to people, I don't know if I should say becoming addicted, but kind of really craving particular food. The MSG kind of can make you crave more of a particular food. So at this point we've got kind of our 5 basic tastes, which will be our sweet, our salty, our sour, our bitter, and our umami. So you can see here in this picture, you have the papillae, and within each of the papillae are the taste buds, and within the taste buds we have our little like receptors for taste. So that's just kind of a picture here that kind of shows you what's going on within your mouth. So as with vision, there is a blind spot for taste as well. So like I talked about, that area at the back of your retina where the optic nerve exits your eye, that's going to create a blind spot in your vision because there are no receptor cells there. There is actually also a part right in the middle of your tongue that would be considered your blind spot for taste. So again, it's a section where you wouldn't really have any concentration of those receptor cells. The physiological details of taste combinations are still hazy, so even though we can kind of identify some potential basic taste, it's very hard to determine kind of the basic taste receptors, what they would be. And it is interesting that people live in different taste worlds. So about 25% of the population are what's known as super tasters, so they tend to perceive certain foods such as some kind of really dark leafy greens and things like coffee as being kind of overly bitter. And so they would be called super tasters, and they have more taste buds than other people. Regular detectors are going to taste less bitterness in those types of foods. And then we also have non-tasters who taste basically no bitterness at all. So there are kind of different levels of taste. And so when people talk about having different palates, there is something to that. Not everyone experiences taste in the same way. The attractiveness of food can also be affected by things other than its taste. So its color, its temperature, its texture, and actually, and this kind of leads into what we're going to talk about next, most of what we consider to be the flavor of a food is actually due to smell. So it's actually due to the gases that are released by the food, and of course we know that our nasal cavity and the back of our mouth are kind of connected, and so that information is kind of passed up to our olfactory system, And that's a lot of what we're experiencing when we describe the taste of something. Which kind of makes sense. I don't know if your parents did this, but when I was a child, if I had to take any kind of gross medicine or something I didn't want to eat, my mom would always tell me to plug my nose, and that always seemed to make the taste a little bit less intense, or a little bit, not so bad. And that probably had to do with the fact that a lot of what I was experiencing as the taste of that substance was actually, in fact, to do with the smell of the substance. So moving on from that, now it is time to talk a bit about our olfactory system. So our olfactory system is involved in smell. It basically detects airborne particles with specialized receptors that are located within the nose. And so we basically have something called the olfactory epithelium, which is a thin layer of cells that are lined by sensory receptors called cilia. So just like the receptors for sound within the inner ear are actually those little hair-like projections, the cilia, we also have cilia that are the receptors for our sense of smell as well. But these are, of course, lining the inside of your nose rather than within your inner ear. And so basically, they respond to chemical molecules in the air, which can either enter through the nostrils or from the mouth. So like I said, sometimes, chemical properties, gases that are released from the food you're eating will kind of rise up into your nasal cavity and be processed through your olfactory system rather than through your gustatory system. So we can have different molecules entering our systems in several ways, but if they're picked up by those cilia within the olfactory epithelium, then they are going to be processed within our olfactory system. So the responses of the receptors combine and are carried to the brain by the olfactory nerve. So that's, again, the axons of the receptors, just like when we talked about in vision. The information travels from the rods and the cones to the bipolar neurons, to the ganglion cells, and then the axons of the ganglion cells actually make up that optic nerve. The same kind of thing happens in olfaction, which is where the receptor cells, the cilia cells, the axons of those cells actually kind of come together to form the olfactory nerve. And basically this information after transduction, and it's kind of in neural signals at this point, is transmitted to the olfactory bulb in the brain for processing. And it's kind of interesting because every other sense, when it enters your brain, I think I probably mentioned this back in the biopsych chapter, but your sense of taste, your sense of touch, your sense of vision, and your sense of hearing, they all basically enter your brain and then go to the thalamus, and then the thalamus sends them, kind of gives them directions to the proper center for processing. So it sends the visual information to the visual cortex, it sends the auditory information to the auditory cortex, but your sense of smell is the only one that actually bypasses that thalamus. So it actually goes directly from your nose through the olfactory nerve straight to the olfactory bulb. So it's the only one that actually kind of bypasses the thalamus, kind of the switchboard for your senses. We've learned that there are no smells of the approximately 10,000 or so that we're able to detect that appear to be basic. So unlike taste, we don't really have any basic scents that we can kind of categorize. And it seems to be that there are as many as 1,000 different types of receptors that exist within our olfactory system. So again, and I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, these senses, your sense of taste and your sense of smell, compared to something like vision or hearing, there's been a lot less research done on them. So vision is by far the most commonly researched, and then probably followed by hearing. But these senses are the ones that we still don't know just as much about yet, so we don't have as much information to share. But as long as you can kind of remember the key details, so what kind of stimulus is taken in, and kind of generally, what kind of receptor processes it, and that kind of thing for each of the senses, that's kind of what I'm hoping you'll take away from these last two sections of the chapter. So in conclusion, it's important to note that we do not just passively register the world around us, we in fact mentally construct it. So by taking in all this different information from our environment, we're able to use transduction and then use kind of the processes of perception within our brain to interpret the world around us. So it is a very active process. Our needs and beliefs can often fool us into seeing what we want to see. So we kind of talked about that in that, you can have things like visual illusions, that can kind of trick your brain into seeing things that aren't actually there. Plato, who's a famous philosopher, said that knowledge is nothing but perception, but he was wrong. Perception alone is not always the best path to knowledge. So even though people say kind of seeing is believing, that's not necessarily always the case. So we're able to use reason, scientific inquiry, and ingenuity to help us rise above the potential handicaps related to our sense organs and to ensure that we are perceiving things as they really are. And that is the end of chapter 4. So at this point, we are finished 1 out of our 2 chapters for the final. So I am going to get started on recording that one within the next couple days. And it's going to be probably a shorter chapter. It used to be that this would be all the content that we would have covered in this course, but the biopsych chapter used to be separated into 2 different chapters, and so now that it is just kind of 1 chapter combined, that means that we add an extra chapter to this course. So we will be talking a bit about cognition in the next chapter, so a bit about thinking and a bit about language. So I'll take a look and see how much of that I want to actually cover, because again, I am cognizant that it was something that wasn't really in this course originally, and you will be doing more on intelligence and other things to do with cognition in the next course. But for now, I'll leave you with this, and I will talk to you in the next video.